Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nevin Cohen, and I'm on the faculty at the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy, and I'm also the director of the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute. It's really my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's forum. The Urban Food Policy Institute, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is located at the School of Public Health, but is CUNY-wide. And our mission is to support healthy, just, and resilient food systems, both here in New York City, in the US, and globally. We do that through basic research, through evaluation research to help organizations and public agencies develop food system interventions, and through public education of our thousands of CUNY students, but also the public in general through our monthly newsletter and through these monthly urban food policy forums. Today, I'm delighted that our moderator is Melissa Fuster, who was a colleague at CUNY for many years and is now associate professor at Tulane University's School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. And she'll be introducing the panelists today and coordinating the discussion about resilient kitchens. An amazing book that is a must-read for everyone who's interested in food systems, and was the 2024 James Beard Book Award winner in the food issues and advocacy category. And so we're delighted that a number of the editors and authors could participate today. So without further ado, and please, if you'd like to learn more about the Urban Food Policy Institute, sign up for our newsletter, go to our website, and contact us for more information about how you can be involved in our work. So I'll turn it over to Melissa to lead us off in the discussion. Thanks. And you're muted, Melissa.
You would think, right, after all these years. Thank you. Good morning, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. My gratitude to the Institute for having me and organizing what promises to be a great book talk. The discussion that will follow explores the intricate connections between food, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the immigration experience, with implications about the role of policy, not only to promote health within a crisis, but also the ripple effects of regulation in our lives. The pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to our food system. As we may recall, supply chains were disrupted, restaurants closed, and millions of people face food insecurity. Yet within the crisis, there are stories of resiliency and creativity, many of these taking place in kitchens all over the world. Of course, we know a lot about that bread making, cocktail making at home, Zoom dinners, but there were also negotiations of learning how to live and coexist in close quarters, especially for those of us spending the brunt of the pandemic in cities like New York. Immigrant communities face distinct challenges during this time. For example, in my work, I've been focusing on Latin American communities, recently Hispanic Caribbean communities, exploring how food practices and health outcomes intersect with race and other structural forces. In my book, Caribeños at the Table, for example, food is central in expressing identity, with food practices serving as a means of resistance and also resilience against marginalization and the underlying trauma related to stories of colonialism. This understanding is important given how it can result in persisting diet-related health inequities. And these inequities became very apparent in the pandemic. Immigrants and minoritized communities really bore the brunt of the pandemic while keeping us fed, from the farm to food processing plants to delivering the food to markets and even to our homes. Therefore, their stories making up the book are integral to our understanding of the COVID-19 experience. The pandemic also exposed and exacerbated existing inequalities and the fragility of our food system, highlighting the need for policies that promote equity, sustainability. Yet, this was not always the case, where public health priorities within this uncertain and constantly changing scenario that was the pandemic limited mobility, and in some cases, as some of the book stories present, restricted cultural food practices. Resilient Kitchens delves into these themes, weaving together stories of individuals, communities, and policies that have navigating into the intersection of food, crisis, and change. So let's get to this. Today we have 4 presentations, starting with the book editors, Philip Gleisner, Assistant Professor of Slavic and East European Languages and Cultures at Ohio State University, and Harry Kashdan, Scholar of Food and Migration based in Washington, D.C. And then we have 3 of the book chapter authors, Tien Nguyen, award-winning multimedia journalist and documentary producer, Guillermina Gina Núñez-Bichiri, Dean and Professor in Women's Studies at San Diego State University Imperial Valley Campus, and Krishnendu Ray, Professor in Food Studies at New York University. After their presentations, we'll open this up for discussion, which I'm really looking forward to. Again, thank you for being here, and I will pass it on to Philip and Harry.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Harry Kashdan. I'm so excited to be here, and I want to start by thanking the folks at the Institute for inviting Philip and I to talk about our book a little. When we got the invitation, it was before we won the James Beard, so I think excitement has amped up in the past month or so, and that's been great for us. I wanted to start today by just telling you a little bit about where the project came from. Philip and I were both working at Ohio State in 2020, and our university shut down during our spring break. Our spring break was extended for a week, and then we were told, actually, no one's coming back to campus. Instead, you'll be teaching online. And also, by the way, all of our current grant cycles for university faculty are canceled. Shortly after that, we got another announcement from the university saying, actually, we're going to do a new grant cycle, and it will only be for projects related to the pandemic. Philip and I both had projects in the works that got canceled, and I don't think we immediately thought of COVID as sort of a natural fit for our research interests. But as the news came out during those first months, March, April, and May of 2020, I'm sure you remember, like we remember, first there were lockdowns, and then there were stories about empty grocery store shelves, excuse me, a new fad for baking bread, things like that. And we sort of quickly realized that 2 of the areas where the effects of the first days of COVID were being felt most strongly were in food and in mobility. I work on Mediterranean food culture and migration. Philip works on migration in Eastern Europe. And it suddenly seemed to us that actually our research interests had a lot to say, or a valuable perspective to offer about what was happening around us right in that moment. We were also really conscious of the fact that even though we were working from home, both of our jobs were safe. Our university wasn't letting anyone go. We had healthcare. We were continuing to be paid. And in the food industry and in the restaurant industry, especially, that was not the case. People's livelihoods were at risk. So what we decided to do was to see if we could get some money from Ohio State, which we did, and sort of turn that money back out into a community of folks who work with and think about and make their livelihoods from food, and also folks who are immigrants themselves or come from immigrant backgrounds. So if we can go to the next slide. These are our contributors to the volume. A lot of these names will probably be familiar to you. It's a really dynamic mix of some scholars, some food justice activists, food writers, restaurateurs, all of whom we asked to think about how the pandemic was impacting their relationship with food as immigrants in the United States. And some of them took our prompt and focused very narrowly on things that were happening to them in those first months of 2020 or through 2021. And others took an opportunity to reflect on their lives, on sort of journalistic investigations, on their professional journeys. And what we ended up with was this really beautiful collection of essays spanning really a number of genres that try to express what it meant to be an immigrant in America in the food world during the pandemic era. Next slide. We also asked each of our contributors to give us a recipe. And I think our first prompt to our contributors was give us a recipe that's been important to you during the COVID period. And actually, a lot of our contributors sort of resisted that. Instead of giving us food that they had been cooking during the pandemic, they gave us food that was important to them more broadly, that had been a touchstone for them or that in some way related to the story that they were telling us in the volume. We thought it was important to include recipes because we wanted to, bring in multiple types of knowledge into the book. So we've got the academic language of some of the essays, personal language in some of the other essays, but also the embodied knowledge of recipes, which we think gives people who read the book a chance to interact with the stories that are being told in sort of a tactile, mechanical, and bodily level that hopefully enriches the experience of learning about these people's lives and how the pandemic went for them. Next slide. We also commissioned a Filipino-American artist, Angelo Dolajon, to do custom illustrations for the book. He read every essay and created an illustration to express it. This lent the book its sort of distinctive visual feel. So our hope is that what you're getting when you look at this book is on the one hand, the words, the essays themselves, and then a second sort of bodily level through the recipes, and then a third visual level through the illustrations. And in that way, the book, like food itself, can have a kind of multi-sensory engagement with the audience. Philip?
Yeah, so then, oh, excuse me. No, I messed up my slides. Give me 1 second. This is for the authentic pandemic experience. We have some issues with the slides. All right, sorry, here we go again. So then the idea of Resilient Kitchens was to create a document and a record of the pandemic experience, right? That otherwise would have gone unnoticed or it would have been forgotten quickly. In late 2021, Harry and I got together to write our own concluding chapter, and we had the realization that despite our closeness, after all, we're close friends, we even had a record of what the other ate and drank and cooked. Despite all this closeness, we didn't really know the other's experience. And admittedly, this also aligns for me with an observation from a queer perspective, namely that painful reminder of the fragility and breakdown of community and intimacy that have been rehearsed before. Additionally, looking back from now, of course, everything feels incredibly distant. And when we look at this book today, oftentimes it feels like, oh, it feels like a distant past. And that was the point of this book, because during the COVID, it was during the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic, over and over, we were kind of being told, telling each other how unprecedented everything was, although we knew very well that none of this was. Pandemics have always existed, but we're really good at suppressing the memories of that. So in order to learn from it, or in order to kind of build on prior knowledge of how we make it through this as resilient communities, we thought we needed this record. And this book aims to be that monument to the diverse experiences of the pandemic. And we feel incredibly blessed and grateful to have worked with this exceptional group of authors and chefs and activists. And it only felt fair if we too would share now some of our more vulnerable moments of the years 2020 and 2021 from our own chapter. And we'll start by sharing a snippet from this chapter, a few rather quotidian notes, but for many of you, they might trigger similar or different memories and associations altogether. And Harry will start.
On a cold day in April 2020, Philip discovered a new dimension of food. It was still frigid outside, and the sky over Columbus, Ohio seemed threatening, empty, and endless. He was meeting Aaron, a close friend, by a river in Columbus. There was barely anyone around. Most people had yet to discover the outdoors as their new social space, and even leaving the house during those early lockdowns felt somehow treasonous. As he was waiting, he caught snippets of a conversation between a few men in the distance. Just a flu, one said, and then, no atmosphere on the moon, the flag shouldn't fly. I have something for you, Aaron said as he arrived, reaching into the pocket of his vest. He dug through layers of fleece before he produced a small bag of cookies made by his partner. He had mentioned them before. They're my favorite cookies, black walnut, they're yummy. Standing an awkward body length apart, Philip and Aaron stretched their arms out to hand over the cookies. As paranoid as Philip was about transmitting a disease back then, he probably held his breath for the handover. For a brief moment, they were almost certainly closer than 6 feet apart. Philip was worried about touching the same object as Aaron and about bringing this food from a different household into the home Philip shared with his husband. His anxiety must have shown on his face since Aaron quickly said, "You can throw them out if it doesn't feel safe." It didn't feel safe at all, but the remark stung. To Philip, after all, throwing out food is beyond just wasteful. It is conceptually alien to his family's regime of carefully managed nutrition. More than that, it felt like a double betrayal. Philip could bring the cookies home and put his husband at risk, or he could reject the gift that another person close to him had offered. It seems obvious now that the need to protect your household from the risk of transmission should trump the social conventions of gift giving and receiving. In the moment, though, Philip felt caught between two unacceptable options. He couldn't bring a potential disease vector into the house he shared with his husband, but he also found it impossible to refuse the gesture of care contained in this gift of food. During the first weeks of an epidemic that we had barely any understanding of, food revealed a new layer of meaning. It was an expression of intimacy that had broken down even amid unprecedented public health efforts to contain and manage the spread of disease.
At the beginning of spring break 2020, Harry boarded a plane to Savannah, Georgia, where he was meeting his family to empty out his grandmother's house. The woman next to him on the plane wore a mask. No one else did. Harry used an alcohol wipe to clean the armrests of his seat. By the end of the week, the university had announced that spring break would be extended and classes would be moved online for the remainder of the semester. Harry canceled his flight back to Columbus and got in the car with his parents and sister to weather the coming storm as a family in Virginia. Harry's pandemic unfolded in 3 phases. The first 5 months were passed with family in the house he grew up in, surrounded by his parents and sisters and dogs, alternating nights of cooking. Almost every day, someone in the house would decide to bake something. Vast quantities of wine were consumed. It was a party that would not end, lent hectic texture by alternating relief at being together and anxiety about what was coming next. In the spring of 2020, Harry finished his teaching online. He and his father and sisters set up desks in different areas of the house. In the mornings, they would go to work, laughing at the absurd mimicry of their old structures. By the end of summer, Harry was desperate to go back to a semblance of his real life in Columbus, where, to his own disbelief, he was scheduled to teach in person to a class of 3 masked students who had decided for their own reasons to try to make at least part of their semester feel normal. The following term, he taught a course of 60-odd students online, attempting to accommodate a wild variety of straitened circumstances while managing his own increasing isolation. Like many of us, he found minor salvation in culinary routines. On Sundays, he would cook something elaborate. On Thursdays, he would order takeout, indulging in a kind of laziness that he reframed through a virtuous lens as support for local businesses. In between, he gave in to what was, on good days, a quotidien ennui. On bad days, he lay immobile under the weight of major depression. Yogurt and cereal, that's a meal. Hummus and chips, that's a meal. Don't forget to eat fruit. Don't forget to eat something green. Don't forget to go outside. Don't forget to get out of bed. Many people struggled with the same grim inertia. So that concludes our introductory remarks, and now we'll pass on to our other speakers.
Hi, thank you so much for those wonderful introduction and those wonderful words of just to give a great overview of this book project. I feel so appreciative to be part of it. I'm a food journalist, and what really drew me, what really interested me when I was thinking about what I wanted to do for this was thinking about the ways in which immigrant food sites really very quickly became synonymous with disease, right? Like in the very beginning of the pandemic, you had a lot of vicious words about, Chinese virus, and then that really split over to Chinese restaurants being attacked and being harassed. And that just made me think about the ways in which that assumption, that prejudice really becomes manifested in policies in different ways. So, so my piece, I explore an incident that happened in the early 1980s, and I bring it back up to how Los Angeles was treating its street vendors at the very beginning. And I'll read a few paragraphs in my introduction just to lay out the land in terms of the areas in which I addressed. Okay. Chinese and Chinese American cooking have been ostracized as sites of contagion pretty much since the moment Chinese workers arrived in the United States and were hired at meager wages. So tenacious is the association that there have been various blatant attempts to capitalize on it. In 2017, the trailer for a smartphone game quite literally called, quote, Dirty Chinese Restaurant, was posted online, created by developers who apparently strive to gamify racism. They claimed the game was satire. The game didn't ever launch. In the spring of 2019, a white-owned restaurant called Lucky Lee's opened in New York, advertising, quote, clean Chinese food and other dishes. The owner claimed she intended clean to mean organic ingredients and other markers of the so-called clean eating lifestyle. The restaurant eventually closed. And well into the pandemic, a contestant on MasterChef The Professionals branded her style of Asian street food cooking as, quote, dirty food refined. She claimed she intended dirty to mean indulgent. She eventually deleted that tagline. But the most instructive recent precedent might be an epic battle waged in the early 1980s in California, with food inspectors on one side and Chinatown restaurants and butchers on the other. Thermometers and knives were drawn, and when the dust settled, the skirmish over Chinese-style roast duck and how to prepare it safely and legally would be a pivotal moment for immigrant food culture in the state. It was also a lesson on the opportunities local governments have to support rather than to continue to stigmatize immigrant foodways, and how those opportunities are too often thwarted by prejudices embedded in policy. These lessons have only become more relevant as the pandemic wears on, and the suspicion cast over Chinese food has extended to other sites of immigrant cooking, specifically to the sidewalks of Los Angeles, where the vast majority of street vendors were forced to shut down at the onset of the pandemic. It was necessary, the city insisted, to protect public health, even as though there were no known links between street food and community spread of the virus, and even as the city actively worked to help brick and mortar restaurants transition to a model prioritizing takeout and outdoor dining. So those are the two incidents that I covered, and thank you for putting up this the slide. In case you're not familiar, and I feel like many of you probably have seen this as these butcher shops in Chinatown is a familiar fixture, but basically these are the ducks that were at issue in the early 1980s in Los Angeles. And what happened was you could kind of understand why the inspectors were really kind of just kind of freaked out by it, because everything about these ducks and the way you prep them and the way you serve them is a bit contrary to the way like a lot of food safety handling practices are. And so what they did was, the way the ducks are prepared is that you have to dry them out. Basically, you have to let them hang dry for several hours, and then you roast it, and then you hang it in these windows. And so the inspectors did not love that, because really, according to the health and safety code at the time, you're supposed to keep food really cold before serving, or you're supposed to serve it right after cooking, or you're supposed to rewarm it at a certain temperature. And that is, as I'm sure many of you know, good food safety practices. And again, the way these ducks are prepared just are contrary to that. You can move on to the next slide. And so what they did was that they descended in Chinatown. They went to these restaurants and butcher shops, and they basically quite literally trashed them. They put the thermometers in. They said this is against the code, and you need to be refrigerating these ducks, or you need to be heating them up. And many of these, because that's just not the way these ducks are traditionally prepared and served, many of these butcher shops were not compliant. And you can see this restaurant owner in this LA Times article just voicing her frustration because, as she says, if we put it in the refrigerator, the skin won't be crispy. If we put it in the heat too long, the meat will be tough and dry. If we cooked it according to the health department, no one would come to buy our duck. And that was really like a really important point because many butcher shops, many restaurants, a few of them really actually did go out of business, right? Because this was their livelihood, selling these ducks. That's what they do all day, all week, every year. That's what they do. And so when you tell them they can't do that anymore, many of them were forced to go out of business. And of course, and those that weren't, of course, they lost a lot of money in the inventory and all that labor that it takes to make these ducks. What really struck me when I was researching this article was just the health department's response, right? Because it wasn't an opportunity to say, it seems like these ducks get served a lot here in China, in other countries, and there doesn't seem to be mass outbreaks of food poisoning. They didn't say like, oh, let's figure out why. Like, that seems interesting. It seems like it's contrary to what we know, but it doesn't seem to have a big food poisoning issue here because the health department said themselves they didn't receive any complaints of food poisoning. They were just doing this as a preemptive measure. And so what the department's response was basically to pit science, what they like sort of their version of science, I guess, not against this idea of traditional values, right? I don't care about Chinese tradition. You're in America right now. This is what you have to do. And so from the get-go, there was this idea that like science and these cultural values were not compatible. From this point, because it became such an issue, the community was able to get some political firepower behind them. They found an assembly person who was sympathetic to the cause, and the assembly person said, I will support you to help figure out how we can resolve the situation, but I need to make sure that these ducks are actually truly safe. So what they did was they ferried some ducks. They got some ducks in San Francisco, Chinatown. They ferried it over to UC Davis food science lab there, and they asked them to test the ducks. And the science was on their side. The ducks are totally safe. And my favorite part of that story actually is they were so safe, and the scientists were so confident in the results that they had lunch. They tested the ducks and then they ate the ducks. Like, they were totally fine with it. You can move on to the next slide. And from that, really because of that report, because the science validated cultural practices here, California passed this exemption to the Health and Safety Code. So you ever flip through the Health and Safety Code, which makes for really great reading one day if you're really bored, there is this exemption that's in here that talks about raw duck being prepared in a certain way, and that it's totally fine if you do it according to the provisions here. But this is something that everyone could agree upon and still preserve what makes that duck so great. So I was really interested in exploring this because it really just seemed like a very direct and clear example of the ways in which like certain prejudices really do manifest in policy, right? And that helped inform the way I started to think about how Los Angeles treated street vendors. So you go on to the next slide. Just for some background, Los Angeles and the state of California really didn't have a method for legalizing street vending until very recently, like just quite recently, 2016, between 2016 and 2019, that was kind of the moment in which Los Angeles finally instituted a program to legalize street vendors to allow people to sell food in carts on sidewalks. The problem at the time, though, was because this was like a new program, vendors were not familiar with the permitting process yet. When they started it, they said street vendors can have a little bit of grace period. The program was supposed to launch in January 2020, and the city council said you can have a little bit of a grace period, a few months, to become compliant. And compliance meant navigating a very, very intensive bureaucracy in order to get your permits. It was very expensive to also get the permits, so the permits, they also had to raise funds to pay the permit fees. And they also had to get parts and other equipment that were compliant with the Health and Safety Code. And this Health and Safety Code was really written, like all these equipment requirements were really written to with food trucks in mind. They didn't really think about the idea that mobile food vendors might have different requirements. And so a lot of the equipment that was available to them was not actually compliant to the code. And so that grace period was also intended to give everybody time to allow the street vendors to find equipment that would actually be compliant. You can move on to the next slide. So the program launched in January 2020, right? And we know that 3 months later, that's when the pandemic hit here in the United States. On March 15th, Los Angeles issued a stay-at-home order, and 2 days later, the LA City Council basically issued a moratorium. They basically said the grace period is over. We're going to start enforcing right now. And the language they use, I thought was very interesting. They talk about we need to have these stay-at-home orders to reduce the risk of exposure and mitigate the spread. And in keeping with the intent of these policies, it is necessary to impose a temporary moratorium on street vending in the public right of way to protect Angelenos from the pandemic. In contrast, you can move on to the next slide. In contrast, the same day, they also passed this motion, and it was in full support of restaurants. And again, if you look at the language, it spends a lot of time talking about how restaurants are really important to the local community. They also mention that the closures are important for mitigating the spread. And they also say this: many restaurants in the industry are small family-owned enterprises that do not have the financial capacity to withstand long-term closures, and the impact will ripple through communities in Los Angeles, as many working Angelenos rely on these jobs to support their families. And of course, like that same language really could have been applied equally to street vendors, but the city council chose not to. And I just, like the way I was analyzing it and just thinking about this stark contrast, it just prompted me to think about the ways in which street vendors generally have been considered sites of disease again, and the ways in which that immediately came to the forefront in passing these motions and impacting street vendors and their ability to make their livelihoods during the pandemic. So that was just a very brief overview of my piece. I'm happy to answer more questions later on if anybody has any. Thank you.
Thank you, Tien. We have Guillermina next.
Hello, am I next?
Yes.
Okay, let me
Yes.
see if I can do my share screen. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, you can also go in presentation mode if possible. Thank you, Gina.
Sorry. Slideshow. All right, well, thank you very much. My name is Gina Nunez-Mshiri. I'm at SDSU in Pearl Valley and was previously at UT El Paso during the pandemic when I was here to present, and I'm here to present Carrie. During the COVID-19 pandemic on the US-Mexico border, I'd like to start with a brief just acknowledgement that when all this was happening, we had farm workers working during an intense forest fire, and they became essential workers. And when many of us had to, sequester at home, here we have farm workers becoming essential workers and designated as such by Homeland Security. So the goals of my talk are to talk about how the chapter was organized, and then I'm going to do a short reading. And the way I do this is like the ethnography, autoethnography, testimonials, participant observation. I would include images and dishes I was preparing and sharing them on social media as a way of just kind of staying connected with my family, my friends. After the pandemic, people told me they would kind of consistently look out to see what I was preparing, to see what they could write about or prepare at home and caring for elderly folks, saying, look, I don't cook, but I'm having to work from home. I'm having to take care of my parents. So I recognize how important just writing how I was navigating food decisions during the pandemic as an ethnographer, as an anthropologist, as a food scholar. So the way I organized the chapter is how I use my experience as a farm worker kid and with the strategies my parents used to navigate food insecurity, and then how we navigated going to the supermarkets and who would go into the supermarkets. And then thinking about, okay, what would my ancestors eat? What would they do? And then having to navigate everyday life as a professional and as a mother and as a spouse, feeding a mixed ethnic family, and then navigating food and grief. How do we navigate food during a pandemic? How do we accompany someone who has just lost a parent? Accompany someone when a parent, my mother was in a hospital, and here I am trying to navigate working from home, taking care of my own family, and trying to keep track of my mother's health in a different state. So, to my background, I am a child of migrant farm workers. I've been working on the US-Mexico border since the 2000 in the colonies of New Mexico. Then I moved to El Paso, which is really close by. March 2020 hit, the pandemic came, and immediately I remember going to social media and saying, you know, everybody get a sack of rice and beans. Like that was like a strategy of survival. And then during this time, I also got a grant and kind of started writing and interviewing people about what they were doing to care for one another. I began meal planning, looking for recipes, sharing them online. I know we were separated by time and distance, overlapping work and family obligations. Now I've returned to the Imperial Valley, which is a very fertile region of Southern California, and I'm thrilled and so grateful for us to be here today to talk about this experience of navigating food through the pandemic. This is an image of the US-Mexico border. I was south of New Mexico in the far west corner of Texas. Now I'm in the far southeast corner of California. This is a little timeline of how, you know, I've worked on fixing meals for migrants and refugees prior to the pandemic, and then discussing how to nourish self and others and how to navigate engaging in the workforce and in supermarkets, caring for each other while trying to avoid getting sick. Then since then, I've talked about food as healing, food and community building. I've written about vaccines and food production workers, and then the postscript of what have we learned about food and caring for one another and commensality post-pandemic. In 2020, June, when all this was happening, I had an episode of Taste of the Nation where I was interviewed about working class food on the border. And here it is. Here I am trying to navigate food. And here's a documentary episode on Hulu with Padma Lakshmi, right? Which is all kind of coming together. As a food scholar, for me, this was really exciting because now I'm engaging in conversation about food with people from all over the world. The questions that guided my research were how to produce food, how to procure food, and how do we do it in a safe way? How do we balance work and family expectations to feed and care for family? How do we maneuver having to go to the supermarkets while minimizing risk of infection? How to connect with people we care for while still socially distancing? What are the strategies that people on the border were using? Like drive-by, dropping off foods, or drive-by celebrations, social distancing, how elders were navigating picking up food at a food distribution center. All those things were happening around me, and I'm documenting them as an ethnographer. How to express care, affection, and social solidarity through major life and death events. Those are the questions I was constantly thinking about throughout the pandemic and writing about them, almost in a journal way, almost in an autoethnography. The past guides the future. So March 2020, I remember my parents, what they would do when there was times when they didn't have work, they would buy a burlap sack of rice and one of beans. And then they would complement rice and beans with anything we found in the fridge, in the pantry, in the freezer, or anything that people would gift us that was locally grown in the form of bartering. We were looking for food in local supermarkets. And this, of course, during the pandemic involved meal planning, figuring out what we had at home, going to markets, many of them with empty shelves. And I found that if I would go into Mexican markets, that was not always the case. There was food there. And then in engaging with a clerk while using our mask, she says, well, people buy what they can afford. They can't always afford to stock up and hoard food at home. right? Here in Mexican markets, there was food because people just couldn't afford to take it all home. And then how do we remember our ancestors? Around October, November, Mexicans celebrate Day of the Dead. And I really got to thinking about my mother loved soups and caldo was very comforting, like beef stew, very comforting food. My father was very consistently aware of his cholesterol levels and tried to eat oatmeal during the week. So these are things that I'm like, okay, my father has passed, so I guess I'll prepare oatmeal to remember him. And then thinking about my family's foodways, they were farm workers, so we always ate fruits and vegetables and salads. And I would take to those strategies to like stay sane. Like this is what my family would do. And then trying to use the corn tortillas as a way of staying grounded and connected to my culture. And then I remember my father sharing a bowl of oatmeal with family and neighbors. And that was like his way of sharing an American breakfast in his mind. So during the times of crisis, I would refer back to the food practices of my farm working parents. And then I constantly thought about this question, what am I going to prepare for my family today? We come from different cultures, different religions, different ethnicities, but I know that all these decisions oftentimes fell on the shoulders of women. What will I prepare today? And then how important it is to plan, but how do you plan if you don't always have basic ingredients at home? The decision of what to feed a family can become very complicated. And so I was constantly under this pressure to produce at home while having to work at home as well and trying to, parent and trying to make sure that 3 people connected to the internet could do their work and go to school. And then I reflect on the she session, right? Understanding how many women were forced to leave their careers because trying to keep a career, trying to keep a family was really difficult and was taking a toll on people's mental health. And many people have also, they divorced. This was really difficult, but this was particularly a heavy burden on families and women in particular. So how do we isolate? How do we use technology and still communicate, still stay connected? We learned that when someone had a baby, we could organize a food train and drop off food. We started sharing recipes. We started asking for ideas. What else do we cook with what we have? All these decisions are oftentimes riddled with anxiety. And also, this was a space for me to advocate for a critical way of discussing gender roles and expectations and challenging and pushing back on the patriarchy, thinking critically about all the decisions women usually make about food planning, preparation, cleanup, and pushing for more equity in the kitchen, more equity in the household, so that families can be involved in these decision making. And of course, many of us were making decisions of who would go to the supermarket. How do we minimize the risk of exposure, particularly early in the pandemic? So I'd just like to read a little section. This pandemic has given me time to think critically about the roles and expectations that need to be redefined and reassigned to create more equity in the home. The time is long overdue to make the kitchen an accessible and inviting space for everyone in a family. It is imperative to learn to organize and create meals together. Petrified gender norms and expectations take a toll on life. My spouse and I were raised on 2 different continents, and these simple decisions about what to cook are not so easy in our home. He is from the Mediterranean and prefers meals with a spicy tomato sauce. I like a variety of foods from Mexico, the United States, and other parts of the world. We both enjoy spicy food, fruits, and salads. So this gives us something to build on that we can all enjoy at home. Occasionally, our teenage son will ask for a Subway sandwich, chicken fingers, or hamburger as a treat to alter the routine. That's my timer. And at least eat out or bring food from outside once a week, anything that he was craving. I realized that ads online are also getting to our kids. One day he came to me and said, "Mom, today it's footlong day." And I asked, "Is that it? Mom, have you found your own groove?" My own groove, I asked him to make sure I heard him well. My own groove is a mess right now, mijo. My son, I know some people do meal planning, have lists of chores assigned to each person in the household, and distribute tasks equally among members of the family. I still don't know how they do this. I have heard of friends saying just push back, stop doing it, don't cook, don't pick up. But eventually I have to pick up. I need to make something to eat. Caring for others is hard work, and yet it is work that is often taken for granted and underappreciated. I do what I can when I can. A friend who specializes in massage and Reiki asked me to just think about these mundane household tasks as opportunities to practice mindfulness, gratitude, and meditation. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks, Gina. And thanks, Phil and Harry, for pulling this thing together. And we shouldn't forget that I, in fact, had no idea that this had been nominated for the James Beard Foundation Award. It seems that was Tien's brilliant idea. I stumbled into it once I saw the listing of it. So I'm going to share my screen today. And okay, so perfect. So as you can see, the title is Quarantine Cooking in an Improvised Household. I'm going to start with this epigraph. If you have a home you think you can hide from death, this year more than any other year, that idea has settled. Stay home, stay safe. If you have no home, walk to one. This is by Tishani Doshi. To put it in context, this is in the context where millions of people, eventually, in fact, 10 million people, poor people, had to start walking home in India, where I come from. Home that was thousands of kilometers away because of a lockdown implemented with 4 hours notice, without any arrangements made for more than 100 million people who migrate internally for work. In a way that is catastrophic policymaking by an elite who do not know about the lives of their people, millions of people, or perhaps do not care. Our bigger point today, when you read this piece specifically, is a lot more private question. And the three presenters before have linked the private to the public in interesting and complicated ways. I would say one underlining thing is this piece is not sweet or sentimental, as is none of the other pieces. It is about two friends with dispersed families who come to improvise a household under immense pressure, like everyone, like all of you in the audience, like all of the presenters today. And this improvised household is born out in a context of fear and uncertainty. Fear and uncertainty, anxiety about folks left back home for transnationals, like Gina's example, like mine example, like my father, my 85-year-old father with stage 3B lung cancer in Balasore in coastal India. My brother, who I was terrified about because he's a critical care physician in Delhi, fighting to save lives, often with oxygen running low. Many of you may have heard that during the pandemic in the news. He had 64 patients in the ICU in a ward meant for 48. His hospital had to stretch 345 beds to accommodate 425 patients at its peak. For my co-writer, the challenges were also deeply personal. She was away from her husband in Lexington, Kentucky, stranded for cancer treatment and surgery in New York City. A treatment throughout the whole piece, there's this anxiety about whether her surgery is going to go through. that can only happen if the hospital and the staff are not overwhelmed by COVID. So the kind of the piece is about any household, how making a household, as Phil and Harry suggested, as Gina suggested, it takes work. It's difficult because people have different interests. It generates anger and irritation, but it also has its joys and sometimes dark humor. And this is one example. When in fact Stephanie was wheeled out of the OT after her thyroid cancer surgery, I said, and it kind of stupidly popped out of my mouth, I said, "Oh, you look like a Danish murder victim." This is referencing the Nordic mysteries that we had discovered during the pandemic. And she provides a kind of a retort to it. She says, this provided the precise form of levity I didn't know I wanted. And so care and caregiving is difficult and unequal, full of misunderstandings. And it's about power of class, power of gender. As you will see in my piece, I'll reference power about generation. And the challenge for us was to discover the joys in a household, in a bundle of Peruvian lilies, in a clutch of fresh mint, in a pasta dish with tomato and tarragon, in spite of those challenges. So what I'm going to do next is read out a short section with two voices. The first one is Stephanie's, and this section is called Tension. And this is Stephanie writing, "What are you thinking about dinner?" He asks. Christ, I'm starting to hate this question. It has barely been 12 hours since the last dinner. In fact, I'm hardly thinking about food at all, other than logistics surrounding its procurement and provisioning. I'm thinking we should use what we have rather than go to the store again to appease someone's craving. I'm thinking that the frugality I have inherited across generations that has trained me to look at what we have and then make a plan. Except we don't really have anything, nothing that I would consider to be a successful larder at any rate in good times, much less these times. Remember, this is an apartment in Manhattan, so there's not that much space for larder. And she continues, every day, Krishnendu goes to the store and purchases just enough to make the meals. Every morning, we have to make a new list. The bread is good, but it gets hard overnight. The herbs add a brightness to the plates and to the palate, but they quickly wilt and need to be replaced. It's an endless cycle of grocery shopping day after day, meal after meal. We are supposed to be staying inside. She continues, I have not figured out how to articulate how frustrating it is to have something as temporary as a meal risk exposing us. And she writes, exposing me, that is her. But it is more than that too. It is also the feeling of being unhomed and reliant on the mercy and generosity of someone else. That feeling compounded when the cooking, the grocery shopping, the meal planning, domestic chores I have often complained about being saddled with, she writes, were suddenly wrested from me. There are two adults in this household, but only one of them has the autonomy and the authority to decide what to feed his son. Nor can I protest too vocally about the rhythms of our household. I have rather abruptly, gratefully been allowed to be a part of. So I'm called to the table and served my meals at the designated time like a child. In other circumstances, one might call this hospitality, but it doesn't feel that way. Of what little control remains, I have further lost the ability to choose what I eat or when, end quote. This is Stephanie writing. And of course, at the end, gesturing towards what Jacques Derrida, the philosopher, points out, that there is an etymological relationship, in fact, between hospitality and hostility. And my response to it is, I'll read out one short section. And this is me in my voice. Other than my son, I don't like other people in my space. Somewhere I say, quite brutally, in fact, you are like a colonizing presence. I say that to Stephanie. I need some space. In middle-class urban India, and this is my allergy to her response to the question, can we not think about food? Can we not think about dinner? Can we not make plans about meals? So in middle-class urban India, no one eats just because they're hungry. I'm also older than Stephanie, so my antipathy towards her normlessness in menu planning has the edginess of, in fact, generational conflict. Meals for me are commensal rituals, and it is the job of adults to make them so. So her improvisation, okay, her touches what I write in the piece as the third rail of my immigrant domesticity. I come from a lower middle class in India, having grown up in the shadow of scarcity. My father was a salesman, my mother a stay-at-home mom. We got a refrigerator in the late 1970s, and we did not own a car or a telephone. Things, of course, have changed mightily in India. That is partially what drives my desire to fill my home with books and flowers and fresh ingredients. I've become quite insistent, I found, in this newfound opportunity to signal cultural achievement, what Bourdieu calls cultural capital. I've always loved fresh flowers for as long as I can remember, but the obduracy to obtain them was new. I want them at the dining table, which has also now become my workplace, as you can see in the chaotic space of this picture. No one, of course, needs fresh flowers to survive, but I need these walks, these errands to stay sane and away from the crowded apartment. I resent the new need to generate consent, to be agreeable all the time. I resent the perpetual presence of others in my space. I resent eating canned food. Now more than ever, I want to cook each meal fresh. There was a peculiar obsessiveness in me about fresh cilantro, mint, basil, rosemary, dill. I've never been like this before. Angry, picky, insistent about quotidian things in spite of the risk of contamination, perhaps because of it. End quote. So that brings to an end, in some ways, my the part of this piece that I'm reading out. Now to pull back from it to make some closing points. One I have already referenced, Derrida's question between hospitality and hostility. Our second point is immigrant households may not be any different from non-immigrant households. Our piece shows that they are in fact entangled, and there may be other differences of class, differences of profession, differences of gender. And in our case, one of us with ancestors back to the English migration and frontier settlement, another an immigrant who is not even a citizen, but has professional credentials. So the outcomes are much more different in terms of class and Anglophonity, which in fact frames success in American society persistently. I think our piece also flips the script. It is an immigrant household that provides refuge to a native born at a time of personal and social crisis. So in some ways, it poses questions about power and generosity. Do not just accumulate at one pole of the relationship, where natives may or may not be charitable towards immigrants, and in fact may withhold that charity. In this particular case, because of coincidences, this immigrant had certain kinds of generational, gender, class power over, in fact, a native. So my closing comments is at the end, I might say what the Korean American writer Aro Kwan recently said. By writing things I'm afraid of saying, I might stand a chance of voicing what I, too, really needed and longed to see in words, end quote. By writing down words, that Stephanie and I, came to think about what we were craving, words of emotional complexity, difficulty, and eventually of resilience, as the title of the collection invokes, as Resilient Kitchens. And as all of you know, of course, and all of you feel, resilience is not a sweet thing. It has some bitter notes, some depth in terms of umami, and some saltiness too, anger, bitterness. So I'll end there, and maybe we'll open it up to questions. I'll stop sharing. Thank you. Melissa, it's all yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Krishnendu. I think that the way that you ended really set us up well for what I hope to be a fruitful discussion. I know that for those of you, please provide your questions to our host Rositza, and then she relay them over to me. But in the meantime, as moderator, I get the privilege of starting that discussion. And I've been, even as I've been spending time with the book, hearing you, one thing that I feel that this book is so amazing is that you do sense that very personal experience from the authors, and you also have that experience, and not only at the individual level, and definitely I feel Krishnendu, and we spoke about this before, your piece is like so raw and personal. And then there were others that, you know, Tian's piece with policy. So it is amazing to see the breadth across from the very highly personal to policy and all of that in one single book. And another thing that I really appreciated, and Krishnendu, that the way that you ended is that I think that a lot of the scholarship that we see in food and migration tends to go into the sentimentalism part, which is definitely not in this book, and it's a conversation that we need. So now to get us started, and because this is a talk within the Urban Food Policy Institute, I wanted to start by asking a little bit about some of the implications of your work. Again, thinking about those individual experiences, how we all lived COVID differently, but with this shared trauma. And even though, I mean, we can be hopeful that a crisis might not happen again, but in the world that we live, sometimes we can argue we have ongoing crisis all the time, especially with food. So maybe to get us started, how can we do better? What can policy, government, or even our advocacy efforts, how can we, for example, think more about public policy in a better way that better negotiates that tension between public health, keeping us safe, while at the same time also acknowledging, recognizing, or even leveraging that diversity that we see in global societies within the immigrant experiences? That was too big of a question to get us started, but please, this is open to all of you while more questions come in.
Well, I can start maybe, and hopefully someone can chime in, because this is something that I was thinking a lot about when I was writing my piece, because I think it was, at least for the street vendors in LA, I think it's important. I didn't mention this just for time, but I think it is important to recognize that street vendors weren't permitted, right? They didn't receive health permits. Because of the bureaucracy, obviously, and because they didn't have the time to do it. They didn't receive health permits. They didn't receive food safety training that restaurants would have to receive. And so I think it was understandable that, at least in LA, that there would be an automatic kind of support for restaurants who already had a system in place. They already they're already compliant with these health and food and safety laws. And so all the city needs to do was try to help them figure out how to do takeout, right? And the reverse was true for street vendors, right? Street vendors by their nature are equipped for takeout. They're outdoors, like everything about it was compliant with social distancing, or the idea of social distancing. There was room for it. There's operations. It's, you know, you go there, they know how to pack stuff for takeout. Like at the end of the day, they don't have to change the menus. For restaurants, for a lot of restaurants, it was a huge change. It was a huge shift. And I don't know how many of you went to a restaurant and you're like, oh, this is like way too crowded. Like they set up a takeout menu, but they did not set up a space because they might not have had that space. You know, they might not have really understood how to refigure their whatever outdoor space, if they had any outdoor space at all, for social distancing. So I think it was just, I do think that it was understandable that there was kind of guardrails on street vendors, but at the same time, the ways in which the city decided not to support them in this way, instead of giving them opportunities to streamline the health permitting process, to give them different ways to learn about, you know, to get these permits. They streamlined so many things for restaurants. Restaurants in LA and in California have to get all sorts of permits for outdoor seating and things like that, which I'm sure isn't very true in other jurisdictions as well. And they streamlined that. Like it was the next day that these restaurants were able to apply for these permits, and they were done. That was fine. For street vendors, they didn't make that process any easier. And so when you talk about public policy, I do think that it is important to shift that mindset. And it just seems like a basic thing, honestly. And I think it's just such a source of frustration for anybody who observes it. But it feels like it was such a shift in mindset was so crucial. So instead of seeing street vendors as potential sites of spread, what if they had seen street vendors as potential sites for opportunity, right? For economic empowerment, for viability and ways to enrich the city as a whole, and to help everybody in the city, you know, get food, get takeout, be able to feel safe to get takeout, because that would have benefited everybody. So yeah, so I think that was my big takeaway, at least when I was going over my piece.
Thank you.
I can just a short one, and I think riffing off that, I mean, one of the lessons for the pandemic, and here is, I'm speaking as a transnational, my loyalties in some ways are binational, and a lot of other people's are. It's here and there, but in terms of space. But states, when they chose to do, they can do a lot, as we learned from the pandemic. Okay. And as we learned from the pandemic, even in the United States, where there has been a retreat of the state from social policy, progressive policy investment, if you interviewed people, okay, beyond the catastrophe of the crisis, was poor people, okay, had great opportunity because of massive state investment in terms of paycheck protection, for instance, if they qualified for it. A lot of undocumented workers did not. And in New York City, we had to mobilize the New York State to put in $2 billion for street vendors and others who did not qualify. So for me, the pandemic was an immense lesson on the power of the state, the capacity of the state, if you give it resources. And the resources are taxing people who need to pay the taxes, so that we can have a public policy. For instance, I'll stop with two things: basic income, basic healthcare for everyone. There's no good reason in the modern world for any state not to provide that to its population, be it India or be it the United States.
Thank you. Others thoughts about this?
Maybe ever so briefly in the kind of the editor's angle. I think what became really clear in the process of this volume and our conversation today is the realization during the pandemic that we were really trying to drive home with this project, is that the stakes are really common, and that the interests intersect more than we like to think. And I think that even in the juxtaposition of our contributions, that's kind of highlighted. And I think the work of highlighting these things, you know, that the interest of the nuclear family are not diametrically opposed to the person that is living as a single, but there's actually a lot of commonalities and a lot of struggles that can be addressed more kind of as a collective, and that are so often played out against each other in political debates. And that applies for many of these quote unquote binaries of social categories. So that would be, I know that's very idealistic, and we have one chapter in the volume that speaks specifically around public health efforts in Israel, of a moment of like a very brief vision, and saying that today, again, this volume, looking back at things in this volume, saying this today, it feels particularly loaded. There was this moment of Israelis and Palestinians having a shared, or Arab citizens in Israel having a shared notion of social peace only over that effort to protect public health. A glimpse, kind of a utopian glimpse, in hindsight, really. But so that's another example that comes to mind. If we can hold on to these moments of shared stakes.
Thank you.
Something we learned was really important for us on the border is that, here's this anti-immigrant rhetoric, right? Get rid of the immigrants and all. But then the pandemic hits, and now Homeland Security deemed food production workers as essential workers. That was such an oxymoron. All of a sudden now we're front and center in procuring food for people. And yet the food production workers did not have protective equipment, were getting, they were getting sick at higher rates and were dying at higher rates. This work was really pivotal for me, to work with community health workers, county officials, faculty members. We went into like survival mode, proactive mode, to get the most vulnerable populations amongst us protected. That work has been recognized at the state level now. We just got a congressional commendation. I can't believe the work that we had to do was massive through these amazing networks to really seek to protect the most vulnerable amongst us. And these were the people at the front lines: meat packing sheds, dairies, ag. There were so many components beyond just farm workers that were critical to these conversations and policies to protect the most vulnerable. And, it was a reflection of one of my students, like, wait a minute, the people you're all trying to deport are actually the people you survived on. Take that, really sit on it, and really think about how critically connected we are as human beings, right? Where it's not about us or the other. At that moment, they're producing the foods to keep us alive so that we can stay and work from home. That was so amazing. And it was all this work kind of being pieced together that really gave me amazing insights of documenting ethnography of the border, what we were seeing.
Thank you. All right, I don't know if you have something to add, or okay, that's fine. No, thank you so much. And one thing that I think, going back to that time, is that it wasn't only, right, COVID-19, we also had this climate, anti-migration climate on top of that. So yeah, these stories are so important, and especially what you just said, Gina, about remembering who fed us. Although I think, I don't know if you would agree with me, but I feel we have forgotten again in some ways. And so we do have related to that, I wanted to bring in one of the questions from the audience from Peg Blenchman. And maybe I'll work a little bit more on this question. The original question is, who should be part of these conversations around policy from local, state, or federal agencies? So we can open that question, but then also thinking about the forgetting, right? Because I feel a lot of the protections that were in place have been expiring, yet people are still, many communities are still in recovery mode. And so any thoughts around level of policy, agencies, programs that can be leveraged in advocacy efforts? And I know, Trish, I know you did mention some of that, so we can continue that conversation. or things that you saw particularly in your community also that work really well, but maybe it's not working, or maybe it expired, things that we can hold on to moving forward.
Well, for what it's worth, street vending I'm sorry, I'm based in LA, but street vending in LA like has been the efforts to legalize the street vending has been decades long. It's been going back. It goes back to like probably the early mid 1980s, and there's been various reasons why it has never took hold until recently. And I think a big part of the reason why it finally took hold was because culture changed, right? Like food culture changed. There was more and more people who were more responsive and accepting that we have a robust food culture, and that it is important to our communities, and that policy-wise it should be incorporated into whatever we're thinking in terms of food policy, whatever we're thinking in terms of health policy, economic policy, social policy, immigrant policy. So in terms of like what's leveraged, what was really helpful, I think, was that a lot of the community-based organizations in LA really did a lot of hard work out here to organize. It was just a lot of organizing on the street level, and it happened before, and this time it happened again, and they were able to find sympathetic folks. And that happened, same thing with the roast duck bill. Like they were able to find and leverage people in positions of power in the legislature to help them. And I think in a lot of ways they had to combat the health department. They had to combat the city council members who were really resistant to this idea that street vending should be legal. And so, I mean, I wish I had a better answer in terms of more concrete agencies, but to me, it felt like, in a way, kind of bypassing certain agencies to find the agency that was most responsive and most likely to help the effort. And so these community organizations were able to do that.
Thank you. And you bring in this important point that it's not just one agency with food, it's so many agencies working together. So getting these people in conversations, because I feel your piece about street vending, the stories that you shared, we can find similar stories, for example, in New York. I'm sure Krishnendu can speak a little bit about that globally. Even here in New Orleans, we are going through some issues around food vending as well. Because not everybody can, of course, have a brick and mortar restaurant. And speaking about food migration, food is one of the key entry points for the economy for immigrant communities. So that is very important.
Quick one intervention here, and that's again riffing off what others have said. And what you said, Melissa. In New York City, for instance, the city council passed progressive laws about street vending in the wake of the pandemic, in the wake of Black Lives Matter, in the wake of Me Too, because that put pressure, basically allowed people to think about things. And I think it was Harry or Phil who said initially, in some ways, queering the politics. The politics was stagnated, crystallized, had set in place. It disrupted it, and it opened it up and allowed people to think about imaginative solutions. Like New York City, the city council passed a law that adds 4,000 more licenses and permits. And of course, like anything else, there's always one step forward and then maybe one step back. None of that has been fully implemented. And now the street people like Street Vendor Project and others are putting pressure for progressive implementation of a legislation, which is 400 new permits every year. And how are those permits going to be distributed? So for me, a big lesson was, in some ways, what is an old lesson, which is think big, local, globally, transnationally, act locally. And this is one. On the other side, in India, we have an old legislation from 2014 that gave 10 million street vendors to the right to vend legally as a right to livelihood. But of course, again, that doesn't mean everyone has gotten beyond all the crisis and the policing and the arresting, etc. So organizations are working. So this, for me, the pandemic really showed thinking globally and acting locally was very fruitful and very productive from Gina's example of farm workers, from Tien's example of street vendors, my experience of street vendors in Delhi I was working on, in New York I was working on, in Bhubaneswar, and in 3 other cities in India. Suddenly I could connect issues that were real. And I was taking New York City lessons to Delhi, Delhi lessons to New York City for the Street Vendor Project. It globalized the potentialities of solutions like it had never done before. Before that, people would dismiss that, that's a third world country. We are a developed country. We don't have same problems. What the pandemic did was show that we have very similar problems with climate change. They'll get worse. And we need to connect our local solutions to these global problems.
Thank you. Thank you. We have one follow-up question from Nevin, follow-up on your comments, Krishnendu, about how the COVID crisis, as you have mentioned, unleashed policy flexibility, street vending, sidewalk, but there's still this tension, right, between safety, helpfulness, and innovation, as people procure, cook, and eat different foods. So the question is, how do we ensure that imaginative solutions continue? Again, as we keep forgetting, right, about what happened. Oh, and there's an addition to this. For example, thinking about unhoused people, for example, how nutrition, food policy cannot really potentially get to everybody in these cases.
Do you want me to quickly respond to that? I've talked too much.
I mean, you can, and then if others please can jump in as well.
And for me, that's the lesson in democracy, okay? Which is you have to work with trade-offs, okay? Safety will need regulation, okay? And access will need flexible regulation and opening up the possibilities of it. In some ways, the answer is there's no easy work around democracy. If that's one lesson we learned, okay, that from climate change to the pandemic to local solutions, is we have to be engaged. And here I'm saying I'm an Indian citizen sitting in New York City, okay, and fully engaged in New York City policymaking, partly because of the democratic possibility of being part of the public culture. And that's the power of democracy. Okay, and we use democracy, the instruments of democracy, including local governance. The solutions are not all going to be what I think they should be, and they will be against me in some ways. But can we bring this to the table and show a certain kind of flexibility, agility? And I think the word in the title of the book, how to generate resilient answers to very big and complex problems, that I'll stop there.
Thank you. Other final thoughts on policy before I abruptly shift gears to start closing the discussion? Okay, I do want to, there was a comment that came in earlier that I feel is perfect for beginning to close this conversation that went by a little bit too quickly. I don't know if you agree with me. So there's a thank you from Sarah Sotens. There's no question, just a thank you so much for everybody in sharing your stories. She can relate to the aspects of that you shared, even though the experience was so different. And I am shortening that comment by just saying that it is amazing that these stories can generate all these feelings and memories, despite having been the same as everybody's, like, as my experience or her experience. And she does mention that it does deserve the James Beers Award. Again, congratulations for that. So yeah, I just wanted just to briefly end on that, in that again, thank you really for becoming being so personal and so open in sharing these stories and being here with us to have these conversations and moving us from those personal experiences to thinking bigger about policy and advocacy. So thank you so much. And maybe I'll end by passing it on to Philip and Harry in case you have any closing remarks or announcements about upcoming talks, anything else that you want to share with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for this lovely moderation and for this perfect transition to something else we would like to share. And that is really, of course, the personal dimension of this project is intentional. And I think it came easily to everyone in their own way. And part of this project is a digital community archive that thinks beyond that, beyond the the group of people that is presented in this book. And because we really had that observation that so many people had so many experiences during the pandemic, specifically around food. Basically, everyone shared that. And we wanted to create a space, you know, beyond social media that is kind of fleeting in its own way. And that space is the COVID Food Archive, which is a community-driven archive where everyone is in. We would like to invite everyone to contribute and share their experience. And I think today it became abundantly clear that really the path from the personal toward the big questions that we had today is a direct one, and it is a central one that needs to be amplified. So at I can't even say the word anymore, covidfoodarchive.org, you can both read other people's recipes, pictures, stories from around food during the pandemic, and also contribute your own. And we would like to invite you to participate in that. That was the final thing that Harry and I would like to share, aside from thanking you all for, again, both for your participation and contributions to this volume and your presence today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I mean, if we have a few minutes, if speakers want to say thank you or anything else that you want to add, or I don't know, Nevin, also if you want to close the conversation.
No, just thank you again to all the participants, and be sure for those in the audience that you pick up a copy of the book, and I'm really excited to look at the COVID Food Archive. So without further ado, thanks for attending and participating, and we look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here, everyone.
Thank you.